You know who said there was no wrongdoing? People who knew anything about policing. You know who said there was wrongdoing? Every single Democrat. What I'm seeing right now is the Democrats who run every one of these major American cities are not keeping you safe. They're making your life worse. The level of civilian understanding of how policing works is abysmal, truly awful. Just to take a perfect example, over the past several nights, we've had these riots in Brooklyn Center, and they are full-scale riots. You have people attacking police officers. You've had the National Guard having fired tear gas at people. You've seen people attempting to break in and loot stores. It's really, really ugly. It looks like a war zone in parts of Brooklyn Center. Well, yesterday, the Brooklyn Center mayor said, I don't believe officers need to have weapons when they make arrests. He's going to need to show his work on paper here for me to understand what in the hell he's talking about here.
I don't believe that officers need to necessarily have weapons, every time they're making a traffic stop or engaged in situations that don't necessarily call for weapons. We know that there are many other jurisdictions, or even around the world, where that is not, necessarily the case. It's not needed.
See, one of the things that is very odd about sort of the leftist worldview with regard to policing is the left wants a lot of very stringent regulations on how you live your life. And they want lots of regulations on how cigarettes are sold, for example. Or they want heavy regulations on how exactly you're able to operate your vehicle. They want heavy regulations on virtually every area of life, but they refuse to acknowledge the reality of regulations, which is that all regulations, in the end, are enforced at the point of a government gun. This is true with regard to your taxes. It is true with regard to environmental protections. In the end, if you resist arrest, if you refuse to obey the law, there will be a government gun at the end of it. They don't like the gun. So at the same time they want to promote heavy regulations, at the same time they want to ensure that the government has more power, they shy away from the idea that that power actually exists. So you have this bizarre situation where the mayor of Brooklyn Center is now saying that if you pull somebody over for drunk driving, for example, that the police officer shouldn't have a weapon. Okay, well, what happens when the guy pops back in his car and takes off? You're supposed to stand there with nothing in your hands? How exactly is that supposed to work? And the answer is they don't think about how this stuff works because they don't care how this stuff works. All of it is posturing. It is all rooted in a basic misconception, which is that policing is nice and happy and that everything works out well. Police officers have millions of interactions with people every single year. Millions. Something like 4 million interactions between the police and civilians every single year. And those interactions are generally not wonderful because nobody's having a good day when they interact with a cop. Police officers know this. But again, when you have civilians who don't understand how any of this works, making the rules and doing so on the basis of bad data, that is a bad thing. Now, you should have civilian, I'm not arguing that the police should basically just quote unquote control themselves, that the police should be the only authority in how they use their force. That, of course, would be fascistic. You can't have armed wings of the American government being the only court of appeal. However, the sort of loosening of regulations that you are seeing by Democrats in terms of how you prosecute officers, the attempt to prevent officers from doing their jobs without any sort of expert level understanding on this sort of stuff is really a problem. And it's going to lead to more death. There's a recent study that came out and it showed that in America's major cities, the ones that were riven by protests from 2014 to 2019, ever since the shooting of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, that the number of police avoidable deaths, according to this study, was something like 300. And the number of total deaths that were actually created, in other words, there were 300 fewer deaths because of interactions between cops and civilians, or cops and suspects. But the number of total deaths in those cities that were avoidable rose by something like 6,000. Because it turns out when you take cops off the streets, when you tell cops not to do their job, they won't do their job. And when they don't do their job, bad things happen. Some people on the left are at least honest enough to go all the way here. So obviously you had Rashida Tlaib suggesting it's time to abolish policing in the United States overall. Jason Johnson on MSNBC saying the exact same thing. Honestly, if this is how Democrats want to play it, go for it. We'll see if Americans really feel like they are so safe from their fellow American that the police can just be disbanded.
I've been saying we need to abolish American policing as it currently exists. It doesn't work. You know, the average homicides that are actually solved by police departments, only about 35%. You know the number of rapes and sexual assaults that are solved by police departments? Less than 60%. You know the percentage likelihood of being shot unarmed as a black person is like 5 times as likely than a white person. Policing doesn't work the way we're doing it right now.
I have a question. What does he think the level of a homicide solving, finding the actual perp in a homicide, what does he think that level would be if there were no police? Would it be 35% or would it be 0? Is the great obstacle to solving homicides the police being bad at their jobs, or is it that a lot of people won't testify and give actual witness evidence with regard to homicides? Getting rid of the police doesn't solve the problem of homicide. It creates more homicides. If somebody is raped, who do you go to in this particular case? And the notion that black people are being shot by the police at 5 times the rate of white people is just not true. Okay, statistically speaking, that is not, I'm unaware of any stats that demonstrate that black people on a per capita level are being shot at 5 times the rate of white people. That is a bizarre, again, evidence-free statement so far as I'm aware. If somebody can disabuse me of that, I am happy to take a look at those stats. In actuality, something like 500 white Americans were shot by the cops between January of 2020 and March of 2021. Okay, so I'm not, and the number of unarmed black men, according to the Washington Post, who are shot every year by the police, generally less than 30. Okay, but this is all rooted in basic misunderstandings of how policing works. And also rooted in a certain animus for the police, which results in just lies. To take an example, remember that whole Jacob Blake case? Remember that case where a man arrived at the site of his ex-girlfriend's house and who had accused him of penetrative rape with his finger earlier on in the year, I believe. And she called the police saying this guy is back at the house, and the police arrive. He resists arrest. He has a knife. He reaches into the car. They shoot him. You remember that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris called that guy and talked about what a rough life he had and how difficult it was for him and how terrible the police were? Well, now it turns out that the police officer who shot Jacob Blake last summer is back on duty because the Kenosha police investigation found no wrongdoing. You know why? Because there was no wrongdoing. You know who said there was no wrongdoing? People who knew anything about policing. You know who said there was wrongdoing? Every single Democrat. Everyone. I'm unaware of a Democrat who said that those police officers were entitled to due process and that even the tape was not dispositive with regard to whether the police officers had done something wrong. Didn't matter. Resulted in riots in Kenosha. Remember this. It happened in the middle of last year, not that long ago. You see the same sort of myth-making happening now with regard to the Daunte Wright case. Okay, this was fairly obviously an accident by the police officer who will indeed end up being charged for manslaughter. A police officer drew a gun instead of a taser, which is an inexcusable mistake, and then shot Daunte Wright. Now, there are additional facts about Daunte Wright that we are learning about that cast some serious doubt on the idea that he is some sort of wonderful person, but that is not really indicative as to the crime committed by the officer in question. It does really blow up the narrative that whenever you have one of these situations, whether it's George Floyd, or whether it's Daunte Wright, or whether it's Jacob Blake, the initial reaction of the media is always, this person is a wonderful, tremendous human, and all of the police are evil and terrible. Two things can be true at once. One, the person could be a criminal, and two, the police could have done something wrong, which tends to be more often the case in these controversial cases. But in any case, that's not even the myth-making I'm talking about. The real myth-making is the attempt to rewrite the evidence in the case to now suggest that this shooting of Daunte Wright was not an accident. It was, in fact, on purpose. So, for example, you have the aunt of Daunte Wright speaking publicly and saying this was not an accident, it was outright murder. Now, we showed you the body cam footage yesterday. The woman literally yells, it's a female officer, she literally yells, taser, 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 shoots the guy and says, oh my God, I shot him. It's going to be hard to come up with better evidence of accident than that. But here's the aunt suggesting that it's murder anyway.
Did y'all not see my little great nephew? Did y'all not see that beautiful baby? He is fatherless. Not over a mistake, over murder. Come on. Yeah. That's murder. Murder. Yeah. Say his name. Daunte Wright. Say his name. Daunte Wright.
Okay, I'm sorry. It was not murder. It was a tragedy. It was a horrible circumstance, and the woman is going to end up probably copping to manslaughter. But that was not murder. Okay, and AOC is saying the same thing. Because again, the idea is that evidence is unnecessary in order to declare that the police are really bad. So AOC, the incredible, brilliant, insightful, fresh-faced, so faced, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez, famous mostly for being very popular on Twitter, she tweeted out, Daunte Wright's killing was not a random, disconnected accident. Oh, it wasn't? Really? Explain. It was the repeated outcome of an indefensible system that grants impunity for state violence, rewards it with endlessly growing budgets at the cost of community investment, and targets those who question that order. Okay, that is just insane. I'm sorry. That's crazy. When she says that Daunte Wright's killing was not a random, disconnected accident, which is exactly what it was, that it was the repeated outcome of an indefensible system that grants impunity for this woman's going to end up on manslaughter charges. Rewards it with endlessly growing budgets at the cost of community investment. I wasn't aware that when you actually invest in the police, that doesn't count as a community investment, considering that the single greatest factor in reducing crime rates is putting cops on the streets, and targets those who question that order. Weird, because AOC questions that order, and I'm not seeing the police pulling her over and or doing something terrible to her. I'm not seeing that. Then she suggested cameras, chokehold bans, retraining funds, and similar reform measures do not ultimately solve what is a systemic problem. So she's saying that you can't even take actions that are likely to reduce the likelihood of bad circumstances. She says the system will find a way. Killings happen on camera. People are killed in other ways. Retraining grows money while often substituting for deeper measures. So what exactly is her solution? Presumably, defund the police. And then you want these people deciding what is best for you and your community? It's pretty incredible stuff. Speaking of which, the officer and the police chief in Brooklyn Center have now resigned. So again, the notion that the system is it's a complete failure, and that this particular incident is evidence of the complete failure of the system. The body cams gave you the evidence. The body cams are what let you know what happened here. The information was released to the public. Doesn't matter. The point here from the media, from the Democrats, is that the cops are always bad. The cops have to be stopped. The cops are a rampant fascist force out of control. And undergirding so much of what Democrats talk about cops is this. They have this bifurcated view of cops. On the one hand, they will pay homage to them the same way that Joe Biden paid homage to a police officer who was killed at the Capitol yesterday, and they'll do so in moving fashion. On the other hand, they will suggest that America's police are systemically racist. And it all depends on the circumstance. But in the end, can you trust Democrats to keep your city safe? I'm wondering, because what I'm seeing right now is the Democrats who run every one of these major American cities are not keeping you safe. They're making your life worse. I hope you enjoyed that clip from The Ben Shapiro Show. If you did, go ahead and hit the subscribe button so you stay up to date on all of our future content.